name is Charlotte Amendola, and I am your hostess. I am so glad that you could join me for History in the Kitchen today. I am super excited to talk to you about the Great Depression, which seems kind of an interesting way to put it because it's the Great Depression. And I am really excited to make frozen fruit salad with you today, which sounds like it's healthy, but it's not. It's a dessert and it's delicious. I tried it yesterday during Test Kitchen and it's really sweet and really, really good. So in my planning for today's History in the Kitchen, I was thinking about the Great Depression and I was looking at a whole bunch of sources, and today's sources are the Library of Congress, PBS, The Atlantic, and that's about it. Those are my sources that I used for today. And as I was going through the sources for today's episode, the Great Depression is huge and can be covered in a variety of different ways. So today, while we're making our recipe and we're talking about the Great Depression, we're going to talk about what the causes of the Great Depression were and the human toll that the Great Depression took on people, so that we can better understand how people were feeling about the great poverty that ensued in the United States at the time. So the Great Depression was a decade of poverty and unemployment, and it began in 1929. In 1928, there was a decline in consumer demand. So there was a decline in the demand for housing, and a decline in the demand for housing resulted in a decline in the demand for construction materials, for construction workers, and in household appliances. So a decline in the housing market causes a ripple effect for a lot of people. And if there is a decline in building and buying and purchasing homes, then there's going to be a decline in employment for construction workers. Manufacturers ended up reducing the production rates of several products. Home appliances were one of the big products that were reduced, where production was reduced, as well as automobiles, because those were two things that people could put off buying, and they did because they were scared. They had no money and they weren't going to use the money that they did have to make those kinds of purchases. In addition to all of that, agricultural prices plummeted. So the price of any of your fruits and vegetables that you would normally get went down, and that affects farmers and the way that farmers are living. So this decline in the housing market and decline in consumer demand is going to really hit every sector of our economy hard in 1928 and 1929. So in the decade prior to the Great Depression, in the 1920s, people invested heavily in the stock market. Lots of people bought lots of stock, and they bought their stocks on something called margin. So when you buy a stock on margin, it means you're using credit to buy the stock. You don't have the money to get it now, but you figure you'll pay for it later. So people took out loans to pay for those stocks, and they hoped that in the end, when they sold those stocks, that they would be able to pay back the loan that they took to buy the stock on margin, as well as get some profit for themselves. By 1929, small investors, so people kind of like you and me perhaps, had taken a combined total of, wait for it, $8.5 billion in loans to buy stocks. That's quite a lot of money. So you should not invest in what you don't have. That's kind of the moral of the story in this part. And economic speculation, so people thinking that stocks are going to be worth more, caused a bubble in the stock market. And we all know what happens to bubbles. If I took the dawn from behind me and made a bubble, it doesn't last forever. Bubbles pop. And this bubble absolutely popped. Speculators knew that they could lose lots of money in a downturn of the stock market, but nobody was really expecting it. They were riding this high of the stock market going up and up and up and up, and everybody was really excited. However, the stock market does take a downturn in September of 1929, and panic selling starts taking place on the New York Stock Exchange. By October 24th, 1929, also known as Black Thursday, the value of stocks dropped by 40%, which means that the people who bought those stocks on margin, when they sold them, wouldn't have enough money to pay their loans back, or the loans that they took out to get those stocks in the first place. And by October 29th, 1929, the stock market crashed. So the crash of the stock market has economic and psychological effects because of bankruptcies, because of business closures, because workers are fired, and because of bank failures. So there's this ripple effect from the stock market to the rest of the people in the United States, both the people who invested in stocks and the people who had never invested at all. If you're just joining us, thank you so much for coming. This is History in the Kitchen. Keep in mind that this is the last week that we'll be doing this on Friday. We're going to move to Saturdays at 1 o'clock starting next week because we're returning to school. If you are interested in following me, you can find me online at www.teachinghistoryherway.com or on Instagram and Facebook, Teaching History Her Way, or on Twitter at Just History Her Way. And I would love it if you followed me. I would also love it if you shared the video if you're watching so that other people can learn about the Great Depression also, or if you want to just give the video a like, that would be okay with me too. Okay, so back to the Great Depression. Once the stock market crashes, not only are people who took out loans on margin or bought stock on margin defaulting on their loans, but farmers are defaulting on their loans too. Banks are failing. There's no Federal Deposit Insurance Company, no FDIC, and this is going to lead to bank runs. And what a bank run is people are going to run to the bank and they're going to take out all of the money that they deposited so that they can take it home. Because if a bank closes without the FDIC, that's a New Deal program that we'll talk about in another time. Without the FDIC, you lose all of your deposit money. So people run to the bank to get it back. Now, here's the tricky thing about banks. When you deposit your money in the bank, they don't just keep it there. It's not like Scrooge McDuck where they can dive in and they can swim around in it. What happens to your money is they use that money to make loans to other people. And that's how banks communicate with each other. That's how they deal with each other. And banks make money off of your money. So if I deposit $1,000 into the bank will then use my $1,000 to loan to somebody else who maybe needs a mortgage or wants to take their dream vacation or needs a student loan. And then when that person pays the money back, the bank makes money from the interest that they pay, and I get a little bit of interest by technically loaning them my money with my deposit. So your money is not in the bank right now. That George Washington that you gave the teller is not going to be the one that you get back. The money circulates. So in order to avoid losing their money, people ran to the bank and took their money out, but not everybody could get their money because not all of the money was there. So if you were last in line, you were out of luck if the bank closed before you got your money back. So people lost their entire life savings due to the Great Depression as well. In 1932, unemployment was at 24% and the stock prices were down 80%. So we went from a 40% decline to an 80% decline between 1929 and 1932. 85,000 businesses, you heard that right, 85,000 businesses declared bankruptcy in 1932. And by 1933, unemployment was 25%. 11 million people were looking for jobs in 1933. And families were unable to pay their rent and they were evicted from where they were staying. So that's what's going on in the country at this point by 1933. And each part of the country was affected in both similar and different ways. Let's start making our recipe. It's a really, really easy, really delicious recipe this week. It is a period recipe. This is something that you would have made during the Great Depression for a special occasion because it is a dessert and there wasn't a lot of money for desserts. So this would have been a birthday or a celebration or something like that. And we needed to keep it cheap because remember, we are not employed. In addition, we're also dealing with food scarcity. So, what happens, or the way we get to food scarcity, or the way that we get to a point where there isn't a lot of food, is that people don't have the money to buy food, and that also has a ripple effect. Grocery stores can't stay fully stocked if people aren't buying food, and then there isn't enough food for people to eat. So food scarcity, even if you had money to buy food, you're not able to get all of the foods that you need or want. Something similar happened to us here in New Jersey when the coronavirus first hit and the pandemic first started. It was really hard to get certain food items. It was hard to get chicken. It was hard to get canned goods. It was hard to get macaroni. Now, part of that was because people were rushing to the stores and buying up as much as they could. Part of it was because of a break in the supply chain, but nonetheless, food scarcity or not being able to get what you're usually getting or what you're used to is really scary. So we have to keep in mind that psychological effect. All right, so here are the things you're going to need for today's recipe. You're going to need a nice big bowl because this is where the magic is going to happen. I recommend a spatula rather than a spoon because you're going to have to scrape out a couple of cans. You are going to need a pan. Mine is 8.5 by 11. Preferable size is 9 by 13, but you can also make this in muffin cups, yummy, or you can make it in a smaller pan. It doesn't matter. You just have to determine the thickness of the dessert that you want because it looks kind of like a cake. You are going to need 1/4 cup of lemon juice, a 14-ounce can of sweetened condensed milk. This stuff tastes like candy. It looks gross, but it tastes really good. Okay, you are going to need 1 21-ounce can of cherry pie filling. You need a can of pineapple chunks, and we're going to have to drain these. We do not use the juice, so drain this. And some way to get this recipe to not stick to your pan. I use Pam. You can use whatever method you would like, but nonstick cooking spray is the best because it doesn't mess with the taste of what you're making. All right, so the first thing that we're gonna do, oh, and you also need Cool Whip. I left that in the refrigerator because I didn't want it to get mushy. I'll be right back. All right, got the Cool Whip and we're ready to go. So first thing we're gonna do is we are going to mix in our cherries. You're really gonna wanna scrape the can. You need the thickness of the cherry pie filling in order to make this recipe work. We don't want it to be soupy. So this is super helpful in getting the texture that you want. So get as much of that out of the can as you can, okay? And our pineapple chunks, we'll put all the fruit in first. And when we call this frozen fruit salad, we say that very loosely because yes, while it is a frozen fruit salad, sort of, it's not healthy. It's a great dessert though. It's really great for a special occasion. And since it's been so hot, it's even better on a hot day. So let's pour that in there. And we'll put in the sweetened condensed milk. This is super thick too, so you want to do your best to get this out of here because again, this is going to add to the texture of your frozen fruit salad. All right. So once you're done with that, stir that all together. Should turn in a nice pink color, my favorite color. And we're gonna let that sit for a moment, not because we have to for any reason, but because I wanna tell you a little bit more about the Great Depression. So the Great Depression is also going to affect the Midwest in a very different way and in a very special way. Not only are they dealing with the food scarcity and all of the other issues with the stock market that the East and West Coasts are dealing with, but they also have severe drought in the Great Plains. They're now called something called the Dust Bowl because a combination of poor farming methods and not leaving the grasses in the ground that retain moisture is going to make a really dusty situation. When the wind comes through, you're going to get this big black cloud that you can barely see through. It actually hurts these people's lungs. They have to stay inside. Over 200,000 farmers are going to move west to California. And the way that they're going to do that, because they don't have the money to move, is that they're going to illegally hop on freight trains. This is where we get the term hobo from. And this is also why the term hobo is particularly insensitive, because you're talking about people who literally have to run away from their lives to get to another place where they can survive. Families are also going to travel and they're going to search for food and shelter. International causes of the Great Depression are also involved. So it's not just stuff that's going on at home. It's not just drought and wind and our stock market. There are also some foreign issues that caused the Great Depression to happen. Foreign nations taxed foreign products. So what the United States did was they enacted extremely high tariffs or really, really high customs duties or taxes on other nations' goods coming in. So what happened there was European nations retaliated and put really high taxes on products from the United States going to be sold in their countries. So at that point, what ends up happening is American products are going to lose foreign markets. And that's going to be a really big deal too. And that's another reason why manufacturers have to slow production. Additionally, European nations owed big bucks to the United States after World War I. Due to treaties and loans, European nations owed the United States a lot of money, and they didn't pay, mostly because they couldn't pay, and that's going to cripple large banks. So banks, both large and small, are going to be affected by the Great Depression and by all of these causes. It's just a whole bunch of things that are coming together at once. So just like everything else in history that we've discussed, there is no one reason why the Great Depression happened. It's just a lot of things that are going to come together at just the right time to make everybody sad and miserable. So the human toll of the Great Depression is huge. First of all, in the 1920s, people had this sense of self-made men and success is earned, and if you lose or if you're failing, you deserve it. That is the attitude in the 1920s. So fast forward to 1929, you have all these men who consider themselves to be the breadwinners of the family, and they can no longer provide. They feel absolutely humiliated to go and ask for help. Children are going to go to work sometimes because they need to work when the parents can't find it. And women are actually going to join the workforce in larger numbers. There is widespread homelessness. The Great Depression fueled discrimination against different groups of people, and it also increased migrant labor. So let's talk about homelessness first. Many people were evicted from their homes and they were forced to live in these shanty towns, which are called Hoovervilles. And Hoovervilles are named after Herbert Hoover, who was the president when the Great Depression started. He didn't last very long, and here's why. Number one, he refused to put any relief into effect. He believed that after 60 days, the stock market crash was going to be done and everything was going to be just fine all by itself. He opposed all direct government relief, and almost like to throw it in the faces of people, he continued throwing really big and lavish parties at the White House. Meanwhile, as he was throwing these parties at the White House, bread lines were dispensing 85,000 meals a day by 1932. So this is not a bread line, but this is a soup kitchen. The soup kitchen was invented during the Great Depression, and the soup kitchen was sometimes the only place where people got one meal a day. They ate one meal a day, and it would come from a soup kitchen. So this is a group of men waiting in line at a soup kitchen. Okay. Hoovervilles, those shanty towns that I was talking about, this is a Hooverville on the Great Lawn in Central Park. The largest Hooverville had a church and a mayor, and that was in St. Louis. And this particular Hooverville had some construction workers. Some Hoovervilles actually had construction workers living there, and they would build houses out of stone. But most people lived in shelters of cardboard or wood from crates and fences or whatever materials they had. And Hoovervilles had no running water. They had no bathrooms. They were completely unsanitary, and illness spread like wildfire in a Hooverville. There were also things called Hoover blankets. That was a newspaper because that was how people were keeping warm. And the Hoover flag. The Hoover flag was the empty pocket turned inside out. So there was a lot of hate going on, a lot of shade thrown at Herbert Hoover. And quite frankly, in my humble historian opinion, I think he deserved it because he did not do anything to help. FDR was elected in 1932, and his New Deal economic recovery plan had a program for the homeless. The New Deal is a totally separate history in the kitchen, and we will talk about that at another time. But let's just say FDR comes in, and the New Deal is his way of solving problems. And part of the New Deal had something called the Federal Transient Service, and that Federal Transient Service was run by the government to help people and to help combat homelessness. Let's head back to the Dust Bowl, because the Dust Bowl is not going to create these Hoovervilles, because you can't stay in a Hooverville in the Dust Bowl. You can't stay in the Dust Bowl at all. The dust storms were happening in Texas, in Oklahoma, New Mexico, Colorado, and Kansas. There was severe drought, and you could even see this dust in East Coast towns, in East Coast cities. So the dust was spreading all over the nation, but by far the hardest place to live was in the Dust Bowl. And over 500,000 people were left homeless due to these dust storms. In fact, the 30s got nicknamed the Dirty 30s because of these conditions. And many farmers were forced to leave to find work and land elsewhere, and some of them were forced to become migrant workers. This was the largest migration in U.S. history in a short period. And 2.5 million people left the Plains states by the 1940s because the economic conditions were so bad. But when they got to the places where they were going, such as California, they found that the economic conditions there weren't much better. Just the weather was a little bit better. There were two different kinds of migrant workers. Migrant labor basically means that there are people who move to harvest crops. Usually at this time period, it was poor farm workers who had no farm left to work. They had to do something, and their specialty was farming. You've got two kinds. You have seasonal migrant workers and permanent migrant workers. Seasonal migrant workers travel with the crops, so they go to places where crops are being harvested. Permanent migrant workers stay in one place, and neither had legal protection from the government. They were treated terribly. The conditions in which they worked were bad, the pay was bad, and the labor practices overall were just unfair. Most of these migrants are from Oklahoma, or were from Oklahoma. They were called Okies, and Okies became a derogatory term for white people, Cherokee Native Americans who were working as migrant workers. So you have discrimination happening against these people who are just trying to find work. This is a famous photo by Dorothy Lang. She documented migrant workers. This is a woman worrying, basically, if you can take a look at her face. She's with her two children, and they're taking a break from harvesting peas. So the Great Depression was especially bad for Black Americans. Conditions in the country exacerbated racism and discrimination, and people were really open about it. Jobs were taken from Black people. Black people were fired so that white people could fill their jobs. In the 1930s, there was an organization called the Black Shirts, and it recruited 40,000 people to their racist agenda, which basically said that they would not hire a Black person if a white person needed a job. Black unemployment was almost 50% by 1932, and lynchings rose. So in 1932, there were 8 lynchings documented. By 1933, there were 28. So the Depression exacerbated racism amongst Americans. In the Southwest, people were claiming that Hispanic workers were taking jobs from white people. This sounds a bit repetitive in history today, doesn't it? The U.S. Department of Labor deported 82,000 Mexican laborers. And 500,000 more were either tricked or threatened to go to Mexico. Most came legally, but lacked the documentation to show that they had that they were legally citizens. Because you have to remember, immigration law in this time period was a lot different than it is today. So being a person who came legally today is different, or who is documented today, because every person is legal. There's no such thing as an alien human being. Every person that comes and is documented today is documented in a different way than they would have been in 1932. So these people were documented, and they were citizens, but they didn't have the piece of paper to show it. And they wouldn't have been given that piece of paper necessarily, or they might have lost it. So they were deported, and also the government started ignoring the part of the Constitution that said that children who were born here were citizens. So those people would have been deported too. In addition, there's also discrimination against women. Women are seen as stealing jobs as well, stealing jobs from men. So like, for example, 77% of schools in the 1930s wouldn't hire married female teachers, and then they fired 63% of women who were already working when they got married, who were already working in school. So women were getting fired so that men could take the jobs instead. All right, so let's get back to our delicious, our super delicious fruit salad. Next thing that we're gonna do is we are going to spray the pan so that we don't forget. All right. And we will add our 1/4 cup of lemon juice. This does not change the sweetness of it, so I don't want you to worry about adding this 1/4 cup of lemon juice. It's really just to retain freshness and the color, keep that pink color. All right, so we've got our 1/4 cup of lemon juice in here, and now we'll add our Cool Whip. Okay, so while we're talking, some of the ways that people dealt with food scarcity during the Great Depression was the same way that we are cooking this recipe, changing to fewer ingredients so that they don't have to pay as much to make whatever they need, trying to make nutritious meals with whatever was available. People rationed. In fact, I will recycle this Cool Whip container later. My grandma, who grew up during the Great Depression, she would save these, and she'd be really mad at me if she saw me and not wash this out and save it to put something else in. So part of the psychological effect of the Great Depression is people start saving things, reusing, and reusing is actually a pretty good idea. But that's going to be part of it, and they're going to start saving, which is also super good, but they'll become obsessed with it because they're afraid that that things are going to be taken away from them again. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration, FERA, was put together by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in his New Deal, and the government started putting out food and food stamps. Another solution that people had, not a government solution, was to have a potluck. How many of you have been to a potluck dinner? Not everybody had enough food, but if they all came together, they might have a variety and enough food to share. People would grow food and their own food and raise livestock. They would can their food so that nothing went bad and nothing went to waste. And people started hunting for their food. The government also put together a food stamp program for those who qualified, and we still see that food stamp program today. And the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which already existed, helped communities figure out how to efficiently prepare nutritious meals. So the USDA had a Bureau of Home Economics, which was made up of mostly women, and these women would actually take to the streets and try to teach people how to cook with the food that they had, make nutritious meals, and be more efficient. And one other thing that the USDA did was they had this woman, they invented her in 1927 as a counterpart to Uncle Sam. This is Aunt Sammy. And Aunt Sammy would come on the radio and give recipes for food that was distributed by the government. So there are a lot of different ways that the government and the people work together to combat food scarcity. Aunt Sammy's recipes on the radio were on until 1942, or 1932, excuse me. And she disappeared entirely by like the 1940s, but Aunt Sammy was there. So we're gonna put this in our pan. And I also want you to think about what you learned today and all of the ways that people kind of had to depend on one another because of an economic disaster that really was not the fault of any one thing or any one person. So the way people solved the problems of the Great Depression, FDR solved it with his New Deal, but people on the ground needed to figure out ways to do what they needed to do to survive too. And the solution to the Great Depression, one of the largest economic disasters in the United States, was not just programs, but it was about people. It was about unity and empathy. So there was this spirit among the American people that favored experimenting so that they could figure out solutions. This in particular is a very tiny experiment. I would never have thought to put these ingredients together. They favored experimenting. They put aside partisanship for higher principles. They recognized the needs of ordinary people, of one another, to cultivate that unity and empathy and to battle economic devastation. So this is something that we can think about the greatest solution to our greatest problems is unity and empathy and coming together. Speaking of coming together, if you are a fan of licking the spoon, I highly recommend not throwing this away. You are going to want to taste this. Take this, put it in the freezer until it's set, and it's going to look pretty much the same this is what it looks like when it's done. And you'll take a knife and you'll cut it, and you can serve it in bars unless you chose to make it as muffins, then you can pop them out. It's frozen pretty solid. You're gonna feel those pineapple chunks in there. Oh my goodness. There we go. And it's super sweet. And then you can take, there it is. Look at that. Yummo. I cannot wait to eat this. I'm also not going to put it back all the way because I touched it with my fingers. But you can serve this with another dollop of Cool Whip on the top if you would like. That's what the other container of Cool Whip is for. I hope you enjoyed History in the Kitchen today. I really hope you learned something. I hope you remember and learn that history is about all people and it's all interconnected. It has layers, just like this recipe has lots of different ingredients that come together to make it. History has the same thing, and the recipe wouldn't be the same if we were missing any particular ingredient, just like the history wouldn't be the same if we were missing the voice of any particular group of people. I would love it if you would follow my blog, www.historyherway.com. If you would share this video, that would be awesome too, because I want to teach as many people as I can. History and teaching are my passion. I don't know if you can tell. And if you would like, you can follow me on Instagram or Twitter. Or here on Facebook. I would love that. My Instagram tag is Teaching History Her Way, and my Twitter handle is History Her Way. Thank you so much for coming to this week's History in the Kitchen. It is not over because school is starting, because learning never ends, and my passion for history never ends either. So if you'd like to join me next week, we'll be getting together on Saturday to talk about our next topic and make our next recipe. I hope you have a fabulous week, and I will see you next week on History in the Kitchen. Bye-bye. Have a great day.